The story of Jesus healing the blind man is full of symbolism. In fact, you could say that just about everyone in the story is blind to some degree. But it starts off in a rather interesting way, that the disciples, who are sort of half blind, they've been with Jesus for a long time, but they don't quite get what it's all about. And in fact, you could say they really don't get it till he appears in the upper room after the resurrection. But there present to him what was a theological argument at the day. Because you see, the Jews believed that suffering was due to sin. And so there was a dilemma. If someone was born with a disease or born blind, when did they have the chance to sin? And there were two opposing points of view. One was that they took on the sin of their parents, or the other was some sort of concept of prenatal sin. You could actually sin in the womb. Or even the fact that when the soul entered the body, you could have a bad soul. So there was a lot of esoteric arguments around that. And you'll notice that Jesus cuts right through it. He refuses to be part of that argument. And in fact, he turns the whole thing round and says, look, this is not about a theological argument. This is about showing the glory and love of God. Now that's really interesting in its own right, because most of the other healing stories are presented as showing the compassion of Christ for man. So this idea of glorifying God in the story is interesting. And I think it's particularly worth saying that we're not saying that Jesus or God causes blindness in order to show us his glory. The evil of the world is not God-caused, it's usually man-caused, but God will not abandon us when that happens. And it's like saying that the current pandemic is God's fault. Well, it was really the fault of people who were mistreating animals, and an animal virus got into the human population. How can that be God's fault? But what we do know is that God's response to it is where we see his grace and his glory. So here's Jesus. He's facing a man who was blind at birth, and he uses a rather interesting technique to cure that man's blindness. He spits into the mud and makes a sort of clay. So why would he do that? Well, for a start, in Roman times, they thought that spit actually had a lot of therapeutic qualities. They used to dab it on their skin to cure skin diseases, and they used to use it to cure eye conditions and so on. In fact, in the chapter before the one we've read, Jesus heals a deaf man using the same technique with spit. There's another reason that spit may be important here, and that is most good physicians, and Jesus was the great physician, know that they should get the confidence of their patients before they can really enter into a therapeutic relationship. And this man who has only ever heard Jesus has to have the confidence that he can heal. And by Jesus using something that the man would know quite well, the therapeutic power of spittle, he's actually calming the man down and giving him confidence that Jesus knows what he's doing. And we do that today. I remember well when I was a young oncology fellow in Baltimore and the AIDS epidemic broke. And the first AIDS patients were very angry, they were very nervous, everyone was treating them with double gloves and gowns and things like that, and they felt like they were pushed aside. And when they came into outpatients, I purposely used to go up to them and shake them by the hand, and you could see them visibly relax, and then you could get on with the consultation. So Jesus is actually putting the man at his ease, and then he's making up this mud, and he gets the blind man, he rubs it on his eyes, and then he asks him to go and wash it off in the pool. Now this pool is actually quite interesting because it's an engineering marvel. I don't think it has much therapeutic effect, although the same pool was used in a story in the Old Testament where Naaman was asked to dip himself in a pool 7 times to cure his leprosy. But the reason this pool's so interesting is that the water supply for Jerusalem was in the Kidron Valley. So anyone attacking Jerusalem could cut off their water supply. So they built a tunnel, they built a conduit from the water supply right through the wall to form this pool inside the wall of Jerusalem. And in fact, the thing was about 500 metres long, so it was a well-known pool. But why would Jesus ask him to do that? And most people think it symbolically is just to say, you obey what I tell you to do and things will work out as I've told you. So it was a test of the man's obedience, whether he would go along and wash his eyes in the pool. So he washes his eyes in the pool and suddenly he can see. And I think it's important to realise why this is such a miracle. For a start, spit and mud are not going to cure a blindness from birth. So there's no doubt that Jesus had to have been responsible for that miracle, and in fact God responsible for the miracle. But the other thing that's really important about this is that the man was not expecting it, and in fact people who are blind from birth, if you fix their physical ailment, they really can't see anyway because they've got no terms of reference for the images coming in. So he wouldn't normally been able to instantly see like that. So again, this is saying this is God's miracle. There's nothing physical that was done here. But when he goes out into the people, we have another case of blindness, because some of the people say, look, I've been passing this guy every day, but, I can't believe that you could cure blindness, so it must be someone that just looks like him. And of course the Pharisees don't want to believe that Jesus cured the man, because Jesus has done 2 things wrong against the laws on the Sabbath. Even making the clay to cure the man was working on the Sabbath. That was against their laws. And certainly healing was not allowed on the Sabbath either. Now, I don't think we should be too harsh on the Pharisees, because in fact they were obeying these rules to honour God. But they were actually blind to what God really wanted them to do. They had substituted their biases and their rules and therefore couldn't see that, for example, healing was a far more noble thing to do than obeying some rule about not working on the Sabbath. So that was the problem with the Pharisees. But when the blind man is first asked about his experience, he says, look, this man, Jesus, cured my blindness. I was blind and now I see. And the Pharisees were really quite askance at that, because in fact how could a sinner have cured a man of blindness, which was something that had to come from God? So they call in the parents because they thought this is a scam. Perhaps the guy wasn't blind in the first place. And it just shows how intimidating the Pharisees actually were, that the parents were totally reluctant to say anything. They said, yep, he was blind at birth, but we know nothing beyond that about who this man is or what's happened. We can't help you. So they go back to cross-question the blind man, who's getting a bit irritated by this time, but the next time he starts talking about Jesus, he talks about him as a prophet. So you see, his spiritual insight is slowly improving as his eyesight did. So he puts Jesus up as a prophet, which is a representative of God. And then he makes the killing argument to the Pharisees that how could someone who's healed me through God be a sinner? Well, the Pharisees, just like they intimidated the parents, because the parents were worried about being thrown out of the synagogue. And in fact, I think you've got to look at this almost as shunning. If you were thrown out of the synagogue, you were thrown out of your social circles and all the rest of it. But the blind man didn't seem too concerned about that, so he took them on. And in fact, what did they do? They threw him out of the synagogue. Now imagine if in this day, every time you disagreed with Benji, he threw you out. I mean, I wouldn't be here now. But unfortunately, we still see people in this world who are so bound by the laws and so on that they're prepared to do injustice to enforce the law. Or even in churches, they want to go through a dozen committees and when somebody has a bright idea and by the time it's gone through the fifth committee, they forget why the idea was bright in the first place. So I think we've all got a bit of Pharisee in us in a way, and we need to get rid of that to be able to see what's going on around us. But here's the most important part of the story. Because having been thrown out of the synagogue, Jesus doesn't leave him alone. It says he goes and finds him. And he goes and finds him, to look after him. So Jesus doesn't abandon us when things get tough. And I think, in this time where we have a pandemic and stuff, that is a very powerful message. He will go and find us and comfort us. But look at the blind man's response to Jesus. He's first talked to him as just a man who healed. He then talked about him as a prophet. And now his sight and his spiritual insight completely revealed. He said, "You are the Son of God." And he bows down before him. And he's actually the only one in the gospel that actually does bow before Jesus. So that's what we're seeing here is the evolution not only of physical sight but of spiritual sight. And then the most damning thing of all is Jesus' ending of this, when he's really berating the Pharisees and saying, look, if you see but you don't understand because of all your biases and the things you put in the way of seeing, then you're a sinner and you'll keep being a sinner while that occurs. So what I'd like you to do in your groups at home or ring someone up is think about what are the barriers in your life to completely allowing yourself to be dictated to, your life to be controlled and made available to Jesus Christ. And see if by exploring those things you can change and increase your spiritual insight. So we're going to now sing a hymn, and this is a hymn about God's grace, because God's grace is available to all of us in times of trouble. And in fact, all we have to do to deserve God's grace is to have faith in him. And John Newton, who started life as a slave trader and became an Anglican minister, wrote this incredibly powerful hymn about God's grace. And I think we all need to hear about that in these troubled times today. So let's sing Amazing.